Most brain surgeries I've performed follow rules of anatomy and science, but one night at St. Jude's Memorial, the rules broke. A patient named Elias Vance came in with symptoms no textbook could explain. His scans showed normal tissue, but his behavior suggested the brain was tearing itself apart. We thought it was a rare tumor or maybe a seizure disorder, but as I cut deeper into understanding his case, I realized it wasn't medical at all. Something else was inhabiting him, something medicine couldn't touch. And that's when the haunting began. Emergency alerts in the hospital usually develop a rhythm. Even the most chaotic nights create patterns you learn to recognize. Trauma codes, stroke pages, rapid responses. The night Elias Vance arrived disrupted every rhythm we had come to expect. I remember the clock glowing just past 1 a.m. St. Jude's Memorial was unusually still. The ER's quiet had a different weight to it, heavy, as though something waited to shatter it. When the call came from the admitting nurse, there was no clarity, only the word unstable repeated. No one explained why. That became the first mark of how irregular this case would be. I walked into the emergency department expecting the usual, a crash cart nearby, staff bracing for trauma. Instead, I found Elias already on a stretcher, upright, speaking in a fragmented way that unsettled everyone. His chart listed severe headaches and erratic behavior. No trauma history. Vitals fluctuated, but not to the degree of major instability. The initial blood work showed values all within range. Nothing in the radiology quick-read suggested swelling or mass effect. For a patient flagged as unstable, he looked unusually composed. But then he spoke, and it silenced the room. Elias didn't string sentences together in the way most patients do. His words came jagged, like a broken radio signal, catching pieces of unfamiliar broadcasts. He used terms like fornix disinhibition and arachnoid packet, vocabulary that even many residents didn't know. He hadn't been educated in medicine. His family later confirmed he hadn't studied beyond trade school. The words sounded rehearsed but out of place, layered with shifting tones. Some repetitions came in quick bursts, others drawn slowly, almost deliberate, as though something inside him controlled the pacing instead of his conscious thought. The nurses grew anxious watching him. One told me she felt like Elias followed her even when his eyes stayed shut. It wasn't that he stared directly, it was that they moved and aligned a fraction before she entered the room. More than one staff member said the same. He seemed aware of bodies crossing space seconds ahead of physical presence. It was subtle, yet there were too many witnesses to ignore. By the time Dr. Anya Sharma joined me, tension filled the room for reasons none of us could articulate. Anya, to her credit, maintained her calm professionally. We stood together, assessing him. Elias looked relaxed, at peace even, though he complained directly to us about unbearable skull pain. That too broke medical reason. The human brain cannot sense pain, only surrounding vessels, membranes, or bone can. Yet Elias pointed precisely to the crown of his head, murmuring that he could feel it tearing. His tone carried no theatrics, no drama. He said it the way someone states their age, steady and sure. We pushed further workups, searching for causes. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, mass lesion, infection. Each possibility filtered through, each returned clear. His blood pressure edged higher into concerning numbers, but nothing matched the degree of agony he described. Sedatives quieted him only briefly, then he snapped back into alertness, resuming the fractured language. It unsettled the younger nurses. One excused herself after he whispered her full middle name, information he could not have known. Hours stretched slowly, consumed by observation without answer. Family remained outside the doors, confused by our reluctance to provide updates. How could we explain to them that no scan, blood draw, or test aligned with what their son or brother was saying? Medicine relies on convergence, symptoms matching imaging, behavior matching physiology. Nothing converged here. Sweet, thorough examination after exam left only widening gaps, all anchored in one man sitting upright, speaking phrases that grew more fractured by the hour. By dawn, after repeated evaluations and steady deterioration, even the most veteran nurses admitted their discomfort. Complaints of pins and pressure filled his record. But the tangible body, the monitor lines and numbers denied every word he gave us. That contradiction defined the entire admission. Elias Vance entered our walls carrying an illness no machine could hold. We had no explanation, only unease. The strangeness would not stop there. The longer we studied his brain directly, the deeper the contradictions became. If the brain looked flawless on imaging, why was his mind collapsing piece by piece? That was the first question we faced when Elias was wheeled into the diagnostic suite. CT and MRI are our strongest tools in neurosurgery, and in Elias's case, both came back untouched, without so much as a shadow or irregularity. His ventricles were normal in size, Sulci and Geary clearly outlined, and there was no hemorrhage, mass, or atrophy. Nothing pointed toward the agony he described with such certainty. The radiologist called down to us, puzzled by the decision to order back-to-back studies for what seemed like a structurally intact brain. To them, it looked like the scan of a healthy adult male. To us, it looked like a lie. Elias's deterioration didn't match the images we held in our hands, so we broadened the scope. Dr. Anya Sharma suggested subclinical seizure activity, the kind invisible on imaging but traceable through electrical patterns. We connected him for EEG monitoring, and within minutes the recordings began spiking in ways I had never encountered. The waves suggested bursts of disruption, but they didn't align with any identifiable epilepsy syndrome or pattern of generalized seizures. It was as if his brain was firing at signals no medical atlas had captured. What unsettled me further was the timing. During some of the more volatile moments in the EEG, Elias whispered phrases under his breath, fragmented in tone but defined in rhythm. The spikes on the tracing seemed to mirror his speech, as though his words themselves created electrical storms. In ordinary cases, you may see discharges ignite movement or reflexive speech, but never the reverse, never speech producing the storm that the electrodes were picking up. This inversion of cause and effect disturbed everyone who watched the recording play out in real time. I considered silent seizures, the kind that leave patients blank and still while the brain engages in abnormal firing. I considered minute infiltrations from microscopic tumors spread too subtle for imaging. But no clinical parallel explained why Elias retained awareness enough to recite terminology one moment while unraveling under invisible pain the next. His consciousness seemed tethered to something outside neurophysiology, swinging between clarity and collapse without connection to what our instruments could measure. The hospital machines, usually reliable, started showing jarring changes around him. Nurses reported that lights flickered in the diagnostic suite while his scans were being run. Power interruptions are not unheard of within older facilities, but what raised concern was how consistently it happened when Elias was in the room. The equipment restarted on its own, sometimes displaying glitches as though his scans had been corrupted before completion. Each time, engineers reassured us it was coincidence, technical noise, nothing worth recording. But coincidence started to feel like a brittle word. When we studied functional MRI meant to test how blood flow increases in response to selected tasks, we found faint signals in regions that should have remained unlit. The language centers fired in intervals, even though Elias received no stimulus, no words on a screen, no verbal cues from us. His brain acted as if it were engaging in conversation with something unseen, pulses of activity flowing through the inferior frontal gyrus without a trigger. These patterns repeated across several trials, stronger in some moments, weaker in others, but impossibly consistent for an artifact. Anya frowned at the results, then shook her head, and we both agreed. If this was error, it was error with uncanny precision. The longer this stretched on, the thicker the gap grew between what we could measure and what Elias lived. Imaging declared him intact, yet behavior and recording screamed otherwise. We depended on these tools, on the clarity of scans that could find tumors a few millimeters wide and trace blood clots through hidden vessels. Now those same tools collapsed in our hands, telling us a story that contradicted the living patient. It was like staring at a set of pristine blueprints while the building itself cracked and bent in front of us. For the first time in my career, I felt the limits of science press in sharply, as though we were standing against a wall with nothing left behind it. Clean scans carved the first fracture in the faith we placed in machines that had defined our practice. And the moment we returned from the suite and faced Elias again, the quiet dread deepened. Because understanding him no longer meant trusting the images, it meant confronting him directly, awake, where the horror of his condition came into full view. When surgeons interact with the patient's brain in real time, the boundary between science and horror can vanish. Awake surgeries are meant to be controlled, procedural, and predictable. The patient stays conscious, so we can test speech, movement, and memory while adjusting the brain carefully, saving critical function as tumors or lesions are removed. That was the blueprint we followed when we decided to take Elias into the operating room for an awake craniotomy. His clean scans had given us no answers, and the hope was that direct mapping might reveal something hidden. Instead, it opened us to an experience none of us could explain, one that left the entire team shaken. Elias tolerated anesthesia without issue. We numbed his scalp, placed the head frame securely, and created the opening with routine precision. There is usually tension with an awake case, but his calm demeanor created an unusual silence across the room. As we began stimulating regions to test response, he surprised us immediately. He spoke, not unusual in itself, except the words were not his own. Nonsensical fragments turned into complete sentences in Spanish, then German, then an older form of Latin that none of us expected him to know. His family had never mentioned any multilingual ability. Staff recorded the audio, certain they would be able to disprove what we thought we heard, but playback confirmed the words clearly. The procedure's purpose was to determine how his brain responded to typical cortical stimulation. When I tested motor areas instead of movement, Elias described elaborate sensory visions as though a switch had flipped in an entirely different system. Where a finger twitch should have been elicited, he whispered about flickering tunnels and walls, warped as though by shadow. We attempted again in other motor regions, only to hear him murmur names, our names, before we even spoke them aloud. He called out individuals who entered the room seconds prior to their appearance. Some of the younger nurses walked back out immediately, unsettled. Dr. Sharma recorded every word while monitoring the EEG. She looked pale as his descriptions grew more detailed. He spoke of a corridor lined with figures he could not see fully, only their outlines. He described a voice naming staff by surname, including those he had never encountered before stepping into the operating suite. Written notes from her log included phrases he delivered while electrodes made only mild stimulation. For the first time during a mapping procedure, speech was not simply preserved, it seemed redirected through channels that did not belong to him. Awake surgeries usually focus on protecting language and motor function by observing clear responses, a preserved sentence, a movement, a repetition. In Elias's case, every attempt created something inverted. Stimuli engaged hallucinations or precognition instead of neurological reflex. Not once did we achieve the clarity medical science promised. It felt as though the mapping connected him not to his own function, but to something external. For every electrical trigger, the response echoed in cryptic words, distant recollections, and untraceable languages. Atmosphere matters in an operating room. You expect steady focus, measured voices, and the reassurance of working within science's boundaries. Midway through Elias's surgery, that atmosphere flipped. Monitors malfunctioned one after another. Power interruptions froze instruments before restarting without prompt. Alarms syncing strangely to the rhythm of Elias's speech. His heartbeat and his whispered words overlapped with a near-identical cadence. We shut down and reset, only for the phenomena to repeat. I caught one scrub nurse staring at the floor, unwilling to continue. She requested to be excused, hands trembling. By the end of the case, staff left visibly unsettled. Several refused to re-enter the operating suite the following day, citing headaches or nausea. Though nothing about the sterile field changed, the memory of that room lingered in a way no one wanted to revisit. The mapping produced records, audio, and data, but instead of providing direction for his treatment, it had intensified our confusion. Every mechanism we employed pointed not to a tumor or seizure, but to a presence we had no vocabulary for. We closed him carefully as procedure demanded, but the doubt remained lodged deeper than the incision. Awake mapping had always been our safeguard, the process that offered clarity where machines misled. With Elias, it betrayed that trust. The surgery ended without diagnosis, and the fear began to stretch beyond Elias himself. In the days that followed, I realized the symptoms weren't limited to one patient lying in a hospital bed. They were beginning to spread to us. Elias wasn't confined to his bed. His condition began reaching those around him. At first, I thought fatigue explained what I was experiencing. Nights in neurosurgery stretch long, and exhaustion can blur the edges of reality. But after his surgery, I started having fragmented dreams, vivid and invasive. I woke hearing his voice echo a phrase he repeated during mapping, even though the corridor outside my apartment was silent. The words had no direct translation. They were fractured, clipped halfway, but they recurred every night as though carried over with me after leaving the hospital. Dr. Sharma admitted she was having similar dreams, her descriptions nearly identical to mine. It was too precise to dismiss. Patients affect us emotionally, but never this directly, never in the shared intimacy of our subconscious. Through the following week, it spread to others. A resident fainted after only minutes inside his room. He later told me he had felt his voice pulled away mid-sentence, as if something had blocked the pathway between intent and speech. He looked pale and shaken when he explained it, almost embarrassed, as though describing a hallucination to a superior, but the event had been witnessed by another staff member who confirmed the resident's lips moved silently before his knees buckled and monitors drew our attention. The record filed it as a syncopal episode without cause, yet the details pointed somewhere far from a simple faint. Charting became unreliable soon after. I found myself double-checking our notes only to see handwriting that didn't belong to whoever typed or wrote the entry. A progress note from the night nurse showed narrow cursive lines resembling Elias's own script from his admission forms, though she swore she had typed the note electronically. More pages appeared with hand-drawn alterations or strangely styled letters replacing standard terminology. These weren't mistakes, they resembled involvement from a third presence writing directly into our official documentation. No mechanism existed for such alteration, and yet the pattern grew steadily both on digital formats and hard copies. In medicine, we sometimes see symptoms spread through suggestion. Patients under stress can develop neurological complaints without a clear organic cause, a condition called functional disorder. I considered it when the team started voicing discomfort, shared hallucination, heightened anxiety, even suggestion pulled from my own unease. But functional disorders do not write in staff notes, nor do they alter the steady hands of multiple individuals across shifts. The events looked infectious in nature, but not with any pathogen we recognized. It wasn't medical contagion, it was something else bending toward us and embedding itself deeper each day we stayed in that ward. One night, unsure of my doubts, I pulled several hours of security footage to review. Elias's room appeared still at first, the way long hospital recordings usually do. A patient motionless, machines humming, nurses stepping in briefly. But at 3:17 a.m., frames showed him sitting upright and staring straight at the monitoring equipment. He tracked waveforms and values with careful eyes. The oddity made me check his chart. At exactly that time, staff notes documented him as unresponsive, eyes closed, snoring lightly. Footage suggested he was alert, awake, studying, Records insisted he was nearly comatose. I played those minutes back again and again, certain a clerical error explained it. The contradiction held steady every time. By this point, nurses began whispering at the station desk about there being two versions of Elias. One safely asleep in bed during checks, another awake without supervision, watchful, deliberate, conscious when he shouldn't be. These discussions spread quietly behind gloves pressed over mouths and side conversations during charting, but the distress they carried was real. The fear didn't feel exaggerated. His presence divided itself in ways none of us could measure. What may have begun as a strange clinical puzzle turned into a phenomenon pressing against the walls of St. Jude's itself. Hallways felt quieter as though sound carried differently. Staff minimized time in his room, often entering in pairs or not at all unless necessary. Elias had stopped being just a patient. He was altering the structure around him. For the first time in my career, we faced the idea that an illness might not live in a body alone, but instead stretch into the environment, imprinting itself on records, machines, and people alike. It wasn't just his case anymore. The hospital itself was showing signs of intrusion, and slowly we began to accept that we weren't confronting medicine at all, but something science had not prepared us to face. Some hospital files are closed with a clear diagnosis, a final signature, and a date. Elias's chart never received that closure. It was sealed with blanks, fragmented notes, and questions that never ended. I was on night rotation when everything changed. The ward dim and quiet in the hours before sunrise. His vitals had been steady when I last checked, nothing to suggest a sudden crisis. Then alarms ignited across his room. The monitors flashed with unreadable values, screens filling with static lines rather than numbers. At the bedside, Elias's chest rose and fell, his pulse palpable, but his consciousness had dropped out. He was technically alive, but it was as though the person inside had been cut off. I called Anya in from her floor. We tried to reset the equipment, cycling through each device. Nothing held steady for longer than moments. His heart tracing spiked erratically, dropped to 0, then rebounded when we confirmed with manual checks that his pulse carried through. The EEG curved wildly, ignoring the rhythm we would expect. Its shapes unsettled me. The spikes didn't resemble seizures or normal artifact. They bent into spaced intervals, pulse like code, jagged then smooth again, as though the machine wasn't capturing neurons firing, but something closer to language. I found myself staring longer than I should, hearing an odd familiarity in the intervals. Anya finally said aloud what I avoided, that his brainwaves read more like human speech than electricity. We adjusted sedatives, repositioned leads, recalibrated tools, but every attempt to stabilize drifted into error. Files corrupted before saving. Some graphs disappeared before our eyes, vanishing from storage drives seconds after recording. The IT representative arrived and failed to reconstruct them, admitting they were unrecoverable. It wasn't one machine, it was every piece of equipment. The data erased itself as quickly as it appeared. Even the nurses noticed, watching frustration spread while trying to document values that refused to stay intact. Through those hours, Elias's body remained neither better nor worse. Vitals fluctuated, but always clawed back to safe ranges without intervention. His pupils responded sluggishly but consistently. Somewhere between alive and absent, he lingered like a body caught on the edge of two conditions. Anya finally turned to me, exhaustion in her voice, and admitted, "This is not medical anymore." Her words startled me, not because I disagreed, but because no physician wants to confess defeat to the unknown. Yet even as she said it, she continued her efforts, suctioning, adjusting, trying to keep him tethered. She fought to the point of breaking, despite knowing what we faced was beyond training. By dawn, Elias had slipped further. Family was contacted, and after long, difficult discussions, they approved withdrawal of aggressive intervention. When the ventilator settings were eased and the final wave of breath left his body, something else happened. Across the ward, adjacent monitors flickered. Patients stabilizing after surgery jolted with sudden seizure activity. In rooms he had never entered, electrodes picked up bursts like those we saw in his own last hours. The residents scrambled, treating seizures that had no shared origin. No one forgot that shift. For me, the timing felt undeniable. His physical body left us that morning, but his medical record did not survive intact. In the days that followed, chart entries blinked out of the digital archive. Radiology files refused access, captioned with error codes. Notes I had written at bedside cut off midway as if deleted by another hand. We searched the network, contacted the administrator, but fragments were all that remained. The loss was chalked up to technical failures, though no other patient data disappeared. Quietly, Anya and I sat together and began writing separate accounts, longhand on paper. We feared that without it, his entire case would vanish into silence, erased as though the hospital itself wanted no memory of him. What settled in after his death was not relief, but corrosion. Confidence in our field cracked. For the first time, diagnosis proved unreachable not because of limited knowledge or missing research, but because forces outside of medicine intruded directly. Elias's file should have ended. Instead, it dissolved, and with it our certainty that every case has an answer if we search deep enough. His story wasn't closed. It remained suspended, unresolved, and bleeding into everything it touched. Even now, years later, the haunting does not come from his symptoms alone. It comes from the fact that some cases never leave the physicians who witness them. Elias Vance became that for me, the one patient whose record still writes itself in thoughts I cannot escape. I entered neurosurgery believing every problem could be solved by anatomy, chemistry, and precision. Elias Vance forced me to confront the truth that not every case lives inside science. His charts, his images, his symptoms, none agreed with one another and none gave us closure. He became a file sealed with silence, yet one that follows me still. Medicine draws lines, but Elias blurred them. I want you to consider where those boundaries end and what waits beyond them. Some cases vanish from records, but they don't vanish from memory. They keep asking questions long after the patient is gone.